The night of October 24th, 1942, near Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, was a darkness that swallowed sound and color alike. The jungle dripped with the heavy breath of rain, the air thick as oil, filled with the hum of insects and the faint metallic whisper of equipment being checked for the 100th time. Every man along the perimeter could feel it, the weight pressing on their chests, the sense that something vast and merciless was moving toward them through the trees. The Marines had been in this hell for months, but tonight was different. There was a silence beyond the rain, a silence that meant an army was waiting just beyond sight. The ground was soft and sticky underfoot, sucking at boots, thick with the sour stench of decaying vegetation and cordite from the previous bombardment. Fog clung low across the coconut grove, where rows of machine gun pits lay half-flooded. Henderson Field, a strip of mud and pierced steel planking, gleamed faintly in the intermittent lightning, the lifeline of the entire campaign. The men defending it knew that if it fell, Guadalcanal would fall with it. Far forward, at an observation post along the Tenarú, a young Marine strained to listen. He could hear it now, faint at first, then unmistakable. The rhythmic, almost tidal murmur of feet, thousands of them, a sea of movement in the jungle. Interspersed with the faint click of rifles, the clatter of mortars being set up, the low voices of officers in the darkness. The Japanese were coming, not probing, not testing, coming in force. Rain slanted through the palm fronds, running down helmets, pooling in the trenches. Radios hissed with static. A flare gun misfired somewhere along the line, briefly painting the top trees in pale red before fading. Then the jungle returned to black. The only light was the faint green glow of radium dials on watches and the ghostly shimmer of bayonets. At the edge of the perimeter, a Marine corporal muttered to the man beside him, "They're out there. I can smell them." He wasn't wrong. The wind carried the tang of sweat and mud, and something else, the faint odor of sake and tobacco that only came when the Japanese were close. Somewhere in that darkness was Sergeant John Basilone, crouched near his machine gun emplacement, listening, waiting. The men around him whispered in short, tense bursts, voices tight with anticipation. Each minute dragged like an hour. Every sound became a question. Was it rain, or footsteps, or death moving closer? The order had gone out hours earlier. Hold the line at all costs. Henderson Field must not fall. Ammunition had been rationed. Positions reinforced with sandbags and rotting coconut logs. Every gun was sighted to cover the next. They maybe had 800 men stretched across a line meant for 2,000, but no one spoke of that. No one dared. Then from somewhere deep in the jungle came a sound that froze the blood in every man's veins. A long, rising cry, unhuman and shrill, the war scream of the Japanese infantry charging through the rain. The ground began to tremble. The perimeter flared to life with the thunder of machine guns and the roar of artillery. The battle for Henderson Field had begun. And in the middle of that darkness, one man would soon stand against thousands, not because he sought glory, but because there was simply no one else left to stand.
John Basilone was 30 years old, but the war had aged him in ways the calendar could not count. Born on November 4, 1916, in Raritan, New Jersey, he had grown up the son of an Italian immigrant bricklayer, the sixth of 10 children in a family that knew more about hard work than comfort. The streets of Raritan had taught him endurance. The Army had taught him discipline. The Marines had taught him purpose. Before the war, he had already seen the Pacific, serving in the Philippines, where he earned the nickname Manila John. It wasn't a name he chose. It was given to him by the men he trained with, a half-joking, half-respectful nod to the years he had spent in the heat and dust of the islands. The name stuck, and so did his calmness under pressure. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, Basilone re-enlisted immediately. He didn't have to. He could have stayed stateside as a trainer. But he wanted to be where the fight was and where the outcome would be decided. By the fall of 1942, he had found it. On Guadalcanal, in the mud and fever and stench of a place no one could pronounce before the war began. To his men, Basilone wasn't a hero. He was a steady hand in chaos. He carried himself with the easy authority of someone who understood what it meant to lead. He didn't shout unless he had to, didn't make speeches, didn't pretend to know everything. But when he said, "Get down," they got down. When he said, "Move," they moved. There was something in his voice, quiet, absolute, that made men trust him. He commanded a section of heavy machine guns from D Company, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. The guns, water-cooled Browning M1917s, were old but reliable. Basilone treated them like living things. He taught his crews to know every part by touch, to clear jams blindfolded, to feel the rhythm of the weapon so they could tell when it was about to fail. "You take care of her," he'd say, "and she'll take care of you." He spoke about the gun the way another man might speak about a horse or a partner. What set Basilone apart wasn't bravado, it was responsibility. He didn't talk about courage, he didn't talk about killing. What he talked about was keeping his men alive. In the humid dark of Guadalcanal nights, when the mosquitoes swarmed and the smell of rotting palm roots hung in the air, he'd move quietly from position to position, checking fields of fire, inspecting ammunition, making sure every gun was fed, every man had water, every foxhole was deep enough to matter. He wasn't a saint. He cursed. He sweated. He carried his share of fear. But he had something that fear couldn't touch. A sense of duty so absolute it seemed carved into him. The Marines around him, boys from Boston, Chicago, Alabama, Texas, saw it and drew strength from it. They didn't fight for flags or strategy. They fought because men like Basilone stood beside them. Sometimes, in the rare hours before dawn when the fighting eased and the rain softened to mist, Basilone would sit in the mud with his helmet off and stare toward the invisible ocean. He carried a small photograph of his parents, worn at the edges, folded into the pocket of his tunic. The faces were blurred from sweat and rain, but it reminded him what waited beyond the war. Ordinary life, peace, the sound of his mother's kitchen, the smell of bread baking in Raritan. That memory was his anchor. Others prayed to God. Basilone prayed to duty. He believed that if he kept his men alive, if he held the line, that would be enough. Heroism didn't enter his thoughts. It was a word for newspapers, not for the jungle. When night came again over Guadalcanal and the rain began to fall in heavy rhythmic sheets, Basilone checked his watch and nodded to his crew. They could hear distant movement again, the low roll of thunder that wasn't thunder. The enemy was returning. His men shifted in the mud, hands on the grips of their Brownings, hearts pounding against their soaked uniforms. Basilone adjusted his helmet, wiped rain from his eyes, and said quietly, "All right, boys, let's get ready. They're coming back." He wasn't wrong. What waited in the jungle would test every ounce of endurance he had ever learned.
Guadalcanal was a name that meant nothing before August 1942. To most Americans, it was just another green dot on a map of the endless Pacific. But to the men who fought there, it became the center of the world, a narrow strip of jungle and mud that would determine who controlled the ocean that stretched from Hawaii to Australia. After the shock of Pearl Harbor and the long retreat through the Philippines, the U.S. needed a victory, something that could break the momentum of an enemy that had seemed unstoppable. Guadalcanal was that place. When U.S. Marines landed on the island on August 7, 1942, they expected to find chaos and disorganization. Instead, they found order. The Japanese had already begun constructing an airfield. The Marines captured it within days, named it Henderson Field after a fallen pilot, and immediately understood what it meant. Whoever controlled that airstrip would control the Solomon Islands, and whoever controlled the Solomons would control the Pacific routes to Australia. For Japan, losing Guadalcanal was unthinkable. Tokyo believed in the idea of the decisive battle, a single massive engagement that would break the enemy's will. They had faith in spirit, in courage, in the unyielding human will of their soldiers, the Bushido ideal. What they didn't believe in was logistics. In Tokyo's mind, a man with a rifle and faith in the emperor could defeat a man with a machine gun and supply lines stretching from San Diego to Brisbane. That faith was killing them. The Japanese could move men quickly down the chain of islands by night through what the Americans called the slot, a long, narrow sea corridor from Rabaul to Guadalcanal. They could send troops and supplies aboard destroyers under the cover of darkness, what Marines would come to call the Tokyo Express. But they couldn't send enough. The same ships that brought men could not carry heavy artillery, ammunition, or food. Every bag of rice meant fewer shells. Every crate of mortar rounds meant fewer medical supplies. By late October, the Japanese army on Guadalcanal was starving. Soldiers were living on handfuls of rice and rainwater. Malaria was spreading through both armies, and the jungle itself seemed to be consuming the men. The heat never stopped, the mosquitoes were endless, and the stench of death hung in the air. Marines joked bitterly that Guadalcanal was hell with coconuts. On the American side, conditions were no better. The Navy had been forced to withdraw its carriers after the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, leaving the Marines isolated. Supplies came sporadically through Japanese air raids and constant shelling. The Marines were sick, hungry, and exhausted. But they still held Henderson Field. That airfield was life itself. As long as the Cactus Air Force, as they called it, could launch planes, the Japanese Navy could not operate freely during the day. Both sides understood that the next major Japanese offensive would decide everything. Tokyo ordered Lieutenant General Hirakichi Hyakutake to retake the airfield at all costs. He assembled the 2nd Division and elements of the 38th Division, more than 20,000 men, and began the march through the interior jungle toward the Marine lines. Hyakutake believed his men's spiritual strength would overcome any obstacle. He had no idea how wrong he was. American intelligence intercepted some of the Japanese radio traffic, but couldn't determine when or where the attack would fall. The Marines along the perimeter dug in deeper, reinforcing positions with logs, wire, and anything they could scavenge. Colonel Chesty Puller, commanding the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, told his officers bluntly, "They're coming for the field. If we lose it, we lose the war out here." It was against that backdrop that Sergeant John Basilone's machine gun section found itself positioned on the western flank of the Marine line, an area of tangled jungle and broken ridges, known as the Lunga Perimeter. The ground there was uneven, wet, and hard to defend. It was the weak point in the line, and Basilone knew it. His machine guns were the spine of that defense. If they held, the Marines would held. If they were silenced, the Japanese would pour through and crush the entire position. As night fell on October 24, 1942, Basilone's men could see lightning flashing over the mountains to the south. The jungle was alive with movement, small animals, branches shifting, and somewhere, faint human voices. The veterans among them recognized that particular quiet before a storm, when the enemy was near but hadn't yet struck. They didn't talk much that night. There wasn't anything left to say. They all knew what Henderson Field meant. They all knew the Japanese would throw everything they had at them. The only question was whether they would still be alive when the sun came up. And in the heart of that darkness, John Basilone was already preparing his guns, laying out ammunition belts, tightening water hoses, feeling the weight of what was coming. He didn't know that within hours he would face one of the largest assaults of the Pacific War. All he knew was that the line would hold or he would die trying.
By the evening of October 24th, the perimeter around Henderson Field resembled a bleeding wound held together by tape and faith. The Marines had dug their foxholes into sticky volcanic clay that filled with water faster than they could bail it out. The rain had turned the coconut groves into a swamp. Every trench was half flooded. Rifles rusted overnight. Machine gun mounts sank into the mud, and the mosquitoes attacked without mercy. But none of that mattered now. The Japanese were coming in numbers too great to count, and the defense line was stretched like a wire ready to snap. There were roughly 800 Marines in Basilone's sector, tired, fever-ridden, and running low on everything that mattered. Across the jungle, more than 3,000 Japanese infantrymen were massing for the assault. They had spent days crawling through the undergrowth, using the monsoon as cover. When the rain lifted at dusk, scouts reported hearing chanting, low, rhythmic, the sound of men preparing themselves for death. It was the prelude to an attack that would test the endurance of every man holding that line. Basilone's position anchored the left flank of D Company. His machine gun pits were the keystones of the defense. 2 Browning M1917s, water-cooled and heavy, dug into the ridge overlooking a narrow corridor of jungle. The guns were positioned to crossfire into a natural choke point, a corridor barely 15 meters wide. If that line broke, the Japanese would pour through the gap straight into the rear of the Marine perimeter, and Henderson Field would be lost before dawn. The problem was simple and fatal. There weren't enough men, and there wasn't enough ammunition. The battalion had been fighting for weeks without resupply. Their belts were patched with wire, their water hoses frayed. Some guns lacked spare barrels. The Browning's cooling systems leaked constantly, forcing the crews to improvise with canteens and even urine to keep them from seizing up. Basilone had gone over the math in his head again and again. Each gun burned through 400 rounds a minute. Each belt carried only 250 rounds. In a sustained assault, even the best crew could empty their stockpile in less than an hour. There would be no fresh supplies, no reserves waiting in the rear, just what they had at hand. He knew what that meant. When the Japanese came, they would keep coming until one side ran out of strength or the other ran out of life. The men around him sensed it too. They worked in silence, checking feed trays, clearing firing lanes, setting up spare barrels beside the pits. A few of them smoked cigarettes under ponchos despite the rain. The smell of tobacco mixed with mud and oil. No one spoke of fear aloud, but it hung in the air heavier than the humidity. To the west, sporadic rifle fire crackled, testing shots, feeling out the line. Basilone crouched over the map lit by a red-filtered flashlight. The paper was torn, rain-soaked, but the meaning was clear. Their sector was the hinge. If the Japanese hit here, and every sign said they would, the defense of Henderson Field would depend on how long his machine guns could stay alive. Colonel Puller had said it bluntly at the briefing. Hold this position or the airfield goes under. You don't fall back. You don't give up the guns. You die here if you have to. Basilone hadn't argued. Orders like that didn't need to be discussed. The men waited. The jungle seemed to draw breath. Somewhere far off, a single mortar thumped, its echo rolling through the trees like distant thunder. The Marines tightened their grips on their weapons. A nervous private whispered, "They'll hit us tonight, won't they?" Basilone didn't look up from his gun. Yeah, tonight. He glanced down the line, saw the faint glow of cigarettes snuffed out one by one. He could hear the rain dripping off helmets, the creak of gun mounts shifting under the weight of water, the muffled click of bolts being checked a final time. Every man was ready, or as ready as anyone could be when facing the impossible. In the distance, the sound of movement began again. a low rustling that grew into a steady wave. Then from deep within the jungle came the first blood-chilling scream, rising like the howl of an animal. Another joined it, then another, until the night exploded in a chorus of voices yelling, "Banzai!" Basilone's men straightened in their pits, hands tightening on the grips of their Brownings. The rain had stopped, and for a moment the world went perfectly still. The jungle ahead was black as oil, the only light the faint reflection of lightning far offshore. Then the first muzzle flash flickered among the trees. He turned to his crew and shouted, "Hold it steady, wait for my signal." The roar that would follow would echo through history.
The first Japanese wave came out of the jungle like a flood of shadows. Hundreds of men charging through the mud, bayonets glinting in flashes of lightning, their cries blending into the rain and thunder. Basilone saw them only in fragments, figures lit for an instant by muzzle flashes, then swallowed by darkness again. The sound was deafening. Machine guns hammering, rifles cracking, grenades bursting in the trees. The air smelled of mud, smoke, and blood. The ground shook under the weight of the assault. "Fire!" Basilone shouted, and both Brownings opened up at once. The heavy guns thundered, their barrels glowing red in the night. The first bursts tore into the oncoming ranks, cutting them down in rows. Men fell, stumbled, were trampled by those behind them, but still they came. The Japanese attack wasn't a single charge, it was a tide. Every time the guns cut one wave down, another followed. The jungle ahead was no longer green, it was a flickering inferno of muzzle flashes. Mortar rounds exploded among the palms, showering dirt and fragments. The Brownings grew so hot that the water in the cooling jackets began to hiss and steam. Basilone and his crew poured in canteen water, then whatever liquid they had left. When that ran out, they used urine, anything to keep the guns firing. The smell was metallic and sickening, but the guns kept roaring. "Feed her! Feed her!" Basilone shouted, as the belts ran dry. The assistant gunners jammed new belts into place with trembling hands. Japanese grenades arced through the darkness, exploding among the pits. One landed near Basilone's gun, throwing him into the mud. His helmet was dented, his ears ringing, but he crawled back to the weapon and kept firing. The first crew on the left gun was gone. 2 dead, 1 wounded. Basilone took over himself, firing short bursts to conserve ammunition. Through the smoke and rain, he saw figures moving on the flank, Japanese soldiers crawling low, trying to slip past the line. He swung the gun toward them and fired point blank, the recoil hammering against his shoulder. The bodies dropped in the mud only a few yards away. The gun clicked empty again. "Out!" someone shouted. Ammunition was nearly gone. The supply line had been cut by the attack. Basilone looked back toward the rear trenches. No runners, no replacements coming. He made the decision in an instant. Grabbing his Colt 45 and slinging a bandolier over his shoulder, he sprinted into the jungle alone. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with smoke and steam. He could hear the fighting all around, shouts in English and Japanese, the cries of the wounded, the constant crackle of small arms fire. He ran crouched low through the brush, stumbling over bodies, slipping in the mud, every step a risk. Tracer rounds whipped past him. He could hear bullets hitting the trees like hammering nails. At the supply dump, he found a stack of belts and boxes. He loaded his arms until he could carry no more, nearly 40 kilograms of ammunition, and started back. Twice he tripped and fell, once face first into a shallow stream, soaking the ammo belts. He got up, coughing, and kept going. When he reached the line, the right side gun had gone silent. The crew was dead. The gun itself was half buried in mud. Basilone dropped the ammo and cleared the breach, working by feel. He reloaded, swung it around, and opened fire again. The Browning barked, sending a line of tracers slicing through the dark. The Japanese charge faltered, broke, then surged again. Basilone shouted for more belts, knowing there were none left. He fired until the gun jammed, cleared it, fired again. A shell exploded behind him, throwing shrapnel across his back. He barely felt it. His world had narrowed to the rhythm of the gun.
The metal clank of the feed, the recoil thumping through his arms, the red glow of the barrel lighting the faces of the men beside him. One by one they fell, wounded or killed, until he was firing alone. He ran back into the jungle twice more that night, each time hauling ammunition under fire, each time returning to the same shattered line. His hands were blistered and bleeding from the heat of the weapon. The air around the pits shimmered from the heat of the barrels. By midnight, the ground was a graveyard of shell casings and bodies. Then came the third assault, louder, closer, more desperate. Japanese officers with swords drove their men forward through the carnage. Basilone's gun fell silent again. Water gone, barrel burned through. He drew his pistol and fired into the dark until the magazine was empty, then picked up a carbine from a fallen Marine and kept firing. The attack broke only when dawn began to rise behind the jungle and the last of the Japanese fell back, leaving hundreds of dead scattered across the mud. The silence that followed was unbearable. Smoke hung low over the ridge. The trenches stank of cordite and blood. Basilone staggered to his feet, covered in grime, his face streaked with soot. Around him lay the bodies of his men and the shattered remains of his guns. Henderson Field was still in Marine hands. The line had held. He looked across the field where the enemy had come, his chest heaving. The jungle was quiet now, except for the rain returning in slow, steady drops. Basilone sank to his knees beside the gun, his hands shaking, the sound of battle still echoing in his head. He didn't know yet that the fight had changed the course of the Pacific War, or that he himself had become a legend.
When dawn broke over Henderson Field, it came without triumph, only silence. The rain had stopped some time before sunrise, and a thin mist hung over the jungle, twisting between shattered palms and the smoldering wreckage of what had once been trees. The air was heavy with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid stench of burned powder. Nothing moved for a long time. Even the birds that usually filled the island with their calls stayed quiet, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath after what it had seen. John Basilone rose slowly from behind his gun position, his uniform black with soot, his hands blistered and raw from the scalding steel of the Browning. His helmet was dented, his face streaked with dried blood and mud. He looked across the clearing and saw what remained of the Japanese assault. A field of bodies stretching back into the tree line, twisted forms tangled in roots and wire, rifles still clutched in lifeless hands. Some lay in the shallows of the flooded trenches, faces half submerged, their eyes open to the gray morning sky. The silence broke with a cough from a wounded Marine somewhere to his left. Then another man stirred, rising unsteadily from the mud. The survivors moved like ghosts, blinking through the smoke and exhaustion, unsure for a moment if the night was truly over. A few looked to Basilone, because even half dead, caked in blood, he still seemed like the center of gravity holding them to the earth. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The medics arrived first, stepping carefully through the wreckage, their boots sinking deep into the clay. They carried stretchers, morphine, and a kind of quiet disbelief. One of them paused by Basilone's gun and whispered, "Jesus Christ." The metal casing was warped from heat. The cooling hoses were gone, replaced by makeshift strips of cloth and wire. The ground around it was littered with shell casings piled knee-deep, and next to them lay the torn remnants of ammunition belts, thousands of rounds, fired through a single night that had lasted a lifetime. By mid-morning, the full scope of what had happened began to emerge. Over 700 Japanese bodies were counted in front of Basilone's sector alone. Many more had crawled into the jungle to die unseen. The 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, had lost dozens killed and wounded, but the line had not broken. Henderson Field was safe. The Imperial Army's offensive had been destroyed in front of the very guns they'd sworn to silence. Reports trickled in through the day, more attacks across the perimeter, more desperate charges, all beaten back with terrible losses. By the time the final count came, more than 3,000 Japanese soldiers were dead around the Lunga perimeter.
The battle that had begun in darkness ended in ruin for the attackers. The Imperial Army's will to retake Guadalcanal had been broken on that sodden patch of ground. Basilone refused to rest. He spent the next hours helping collect the wounded, dragging bodies from the mud, setting up new gun pits for a counterattack that never came. When a corpsman tried to bandage the burns on his arms, he waved him away. His voice was hoarse, little more than a whisper, but it carried weight. He said, "Take care of them first. They need it more than I do." When night came again, the sky above Guadalcanal cleared for the first time in days. The stars appeared, sharp and cold, and the rumble of distant artillery faded into the sea wind. The Marines sat in silence, too tired to speak, listening to the generators at Henderson Field start up again. The faint hum of aircraft engines soon followed, Wildcats lifting into the sky for the morning patrol. The airfield still belonged to them. That was what it had all been for. The official reports would later describe it clinically. Sergeant John Basilone displayed extraordinary heroism in the face of overwhelming enemy forces. He maintained the operation of his guns despite heavy casualties and lack of supplies. The words didn't capture the reality, the chaos, the fear, the smell of burning oil and flesh, the screams of men fighting hand-to-hand in a nightmare of mud and smoke. But those who had been there never forgot. Word of Basilone's stand spread through the division like wildfire. Marines who had never seen his face spoke of him in the same breath as the great names of the Corps. Manila John, they said, held the line when nobody else could. His Medal of Honor citation would be approved months later, but the men who survived that night didn't need medals to know what they had witnessed. They had seen a man refuse to yield, refuse to let the guns die, refuse to let Henderson Field fall. For Basilone himself, there was no sense of glory. When reporters later asked what he thought of being called a hero, he shrugged and said, "I just did my job. That's what you're supposed to do." He returned to the United States reluctantly, sent home to raise war bonds, to smile for cameras and shake hands with politicians. But the war wasn't finished for him. He couldn't stand the parades or the speeches. He said, "My boys are still out there. I belong with them." In 1945, he got his wish. He returned to combat, this time on Iwo Jima, and on February 19th, only hours after the first wave hit the beach, he was killed leading his men through a wall of Japanese fire. He never saw the flag rise on Mount Suribachi. But his name lived on Guadalcanal, on Iwo Jima, and in every Marine Corps training camp where recruits still learned what it means to stand your ground when the world collapses around you. Henderson Field became Henderson Airfield, a small patch of tarmac surrounded by palms, still active decades later. The ridgeline where Basilone's guns once stood is quiet now, overgrown with grass and vines. The jungle has reclaimed the scars of war, but the ghosts remain. When historians speak of Guadalcanal, they call it the turning point, the moment when Japan's advance stopped and the long road to victory began. But for the men who fought there, it was simpler. It was a night when one Marine held his line against an army and refused to let go. He didn't fight for medals or headlines or history. He fought because someone had to. He just stood his ground. And sometimes, that's what changes the course of a war.